Hey, what's up, everybody? Viruses, The Invisible Enemy by Dorothy H. Crawford. This book is part of a series called Oxford Landmark Science Books. I figured it would be pretty good because one of my favorite books, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, is also an Oxford Landmark Science book. There's really not too much to talk about with this book. It's about viruses. It covers what they are and do, and descriptions of many different kinds and classes of viruses, and some history on our experience with and the rise of certain viruses like Zika, Spanish flu, Ebola, and HIV, to name a couple. This book covers some history on outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics, and the first edition was printed in 2002, but this 2021 edition covers the COVID 19 pandemic as well as other pandemics and epidemics since the first printing. This book does make some very interesting observations. For example, the effects that the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago had on the evolution of viruses. This was when nomadism became a less practical way of life for humanity, but that came with some consequences. Back when humans were hunter gatherers living in small nomadic bands, we really were not an ideal reservoir for viruses to maintain their populations. But once humans began domesticating animals and living in agricultural societies, suddenly we were now in close contact in large numbers with the animals from which many of these viruses originated, as well as with large numbers of other humans. And once our populations became large enough, humans could become the primary reservoirs for many different viruses. To this day, we're experiencing an increased level of emerging viruses because of these reasons. And we also need to consider advances in transportation and global commercialization. From an evolutionary perspective, though, there is an upside to humans being primary reservoirs for certain viruses. If we're going to co evolve together with viruses, then over time, less lethal variants should come to dominate the human virus sphere population. If the worst viruses kill their hosts and make their infections obvious, i.e., confer serious symptoms, this would continually over time favor the mutations which would make viruses more innocuous. Such mutations would support the spread of less dangerous viruses as well as continue to become less lethal over time. Our relationship with viruses is pretty fascinating. Essentially, viruses use us and other animals as a means of survival and propagation. They're unlike anything that is clearly classified as living, even other parasites, because they have no means of metabolism or reproduction themselves, so they have to commandeer a host and trick them into making more viruses. All a virus really is genetic material with a protein coating, so they're incredibly small. Even compared to bacteria, they're tiny. In us living organisms, DNA is transcribed into RNA, which is translated into proteins. It can only go in that direction: DNA into RNA into protein. A retrovirus, on the other hand, such as HIV, can actually convert viral RNA into viral DNA inside a host cell, and then it becomes a new part of that host cell's DNA. So when this cell divides, it does so with the new viral genetic information. That's pretty astonishing. It seems to me that by studying this, we could learn some pretty valuable information, but the book doesn't really go into that, which is too bad. But if we can gain a better understanding of viruses, and in what ways might we use that knowledge to our advantage? But that's retroviruses. They're a type of RNA virus. RNA viruses like COVID and HCV are prone to more rapid mutation, so vaccines are less effective. Some persistent lifelong viruses can even cause cancer, which I did not know that. This book uses the metaphor that views oncogenes like the gas pedal for cell division and tumor suppressor genes as like a brake pedal. If these genes are altered in certain ways by a virus, it can cause problems with cell division, which can lead to the development of cancerous tumors. This book also has a lot of interesting information on vaccinations. In 1721, Lady Mary Worley Montagu was the first person to figure out how to immunize somebody to smallpox, and Dr. Edward Jenner developed the actual vaccine. Lady Mary's method involved introducing a tiny amount of the virus onto a scratch on the patient, and this route of entry allowed for enough time before serious infection for the body to mount a proper defense and create the necessary antibodies, resulting in immunity. Dr. Jenner's method used a cowpox injection, which was genetically similar enough to smallpox to trigger an immune response that protected from smallpox. This is regarded as the invention of vaccines in the West, but the book does say that vaccines probably already existed in China, though it doesn't mention anything beyond that. But it does say about how 40 years later smallpox was used in blankets as a weapon to help kill off Native Americans. Some other things that I thought were worth mentioning in this book are the eradication efforts of smallpox in the 1970s, and it was said that within a decade we could see polio, measles, and rubella eradicated too. This book was originally written in 2002, and that statement does seem to have turned out to be true, at least in America. Overall, while not exactly a riveting read, I am glad I read this book. Viruses have become a big theme in the lives of many people in the last few years, so I thought this would be a pretty good thing to learn about. Although I do feel compelled to mention that I spotted several typos in this book, and that's never a very comforting sign. This book covers many virus-related topics, and it's full of information. I just tried to pick out a couple things that I thought sounded interesting, and this new release does contain new sections on COVID. The book has 8 chapters: The Virusphere, Fighting Back, Emerging Infections, 21st Century Pandemics, Past Emerging Viruses, Lifelong Residents, Viruses and Cancer, Turning the Tables, plus an epilogue, What the Future Holds. The book had a fairly dry presentation. One of the best things this book could teach, though, I thought, is a better understanding of how evolution works, besides just all the stuff about viruses. It's a very important aspect that all life deals with, so I think it's valuable to learn this stuff. Besides that, I could see several reasons why someone would want to buy this book. I did. Maybe you've dealt with viruses, or maybe you just like to learn more. We are still dealing with the pandemic after all. If this is the kind of thing you're into, this very broad overview could be very interesting to you. At least it'll provide you with a lot more areas of study to look into. Okay guys, that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to learn more about viruses, check out Viruses, the Invisible Enemy by Dorothy H. Crawford.